Okay, good afternoon to all present. My name is Esther Lambert, Research Associate with the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, and I'll be moderating today's session. Just to get a few housekeeping details out of the way, as always, please save your questions till the end of the presentation, as there will be a half-hour question and answer period. And so as your questions come to mind during the presentation, post those in the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen. And for questions related to technical issues, please post those in the general chat box. Also, just a reminder that the slides and the recording for this presentation will be available on the ICLR website, iclr.org, under workshops at the very bottom of the page. It will also be posted on the ICLR YouTube page, ICLR Info. Another note to just mark your calendars for the next Friday forum, which will be on January 21st. And the presenter will be Lucy Jones, presenting on planning for big earthquakes and climate disasters. And so again, a very warm welcome to all signed into the ICLR's monthly Friday forum. A warm welcome as well to our presenter, who will introduce shortly. The topic today, development, responsibility, and the creation of flood risk in Calgary. Now, although I did not personally witness the 2013 Southern Alberta Flood, this particular topic speaks to me, having lived on a small Caribbean island and witnessing seasonal flooding on a regular basis of homes and businesses along riverbanks and coastlines. And unfortunately, for the most part, development has continued on those and other hazardous areas until the next catastrophe. And unfortunately, in many cases, history repeats itself. And so the questions being explored in today's presentation are definitely important. Why do developers continue to build homes near rivers? Should municipal governments allow it? Where does the responsibility lie? All very important questions. And so we're really happy today to welcome our presenter, Professor Timothy Haney. Just as a brief introduction, Professor Haney holds a PhD from the University of Oregon and currently is a professor of sociology at Mount Royal University in Calgary. He holds the inaugural Board of Governors Research Chair in Resilience and Sustainability. He was also former director of the Center for Community Disaster Research at MRU, and his research topic areas include risk perception, social inequalities in disaster recovery, climate change belief, post-disaster environmental views, and urban politics. And so also his research has been published in a number of reputable academic journals. And so Professor Haney, we are very happy to have you to present today, and we'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful, thank you. Hi, Esther, I really appreciate that lovely introduction. And more than anything, I'm grateful to the wonderful folks at the ICLR. This is the second Friday forum I've been able to do. The first one was in 2018, before COVID, which seems like a decade and a half ago now, with all that we've been through in the meantime. But every time I've been able to connect with folks from the ICLR, folks like Glenn, who asked me to do this one, it's always just been such a positive experience, and I have such tremendous respect and admiration for the work that you all do there. So I'm really humbled and privileged to be able to be here with you all today. I also wanted to thank the the attendees for coming today. I gather that attendance is good for this webinar, and I'm really excited to see that. Usually I give talks to 8 people, 10 people, something like that. So this is just Woodstock for me today, and I'm really excited to be here. To give you a little bit of context, I guess, most of my research has been about the human experience of disasters. I lived in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, went through Hurricane Katrina, which is kind of what got me going in this area. But I also have been in and around other disasters, including the 2013 Southern Alberta Flood here in Calgary. And I do research on the human experience of that, but also a lot on the inequalities that are part and parcel of, but are also exacerbated by disaster recovery. But at a certain point, as part of this project I'm going to talk about today, I started getting a little bit, I don't want to use the word frustrated, but a little bit frustrated in that we continually have to write about and research about disaster recoveries. And I felt like more people should be To use an old metaphor, instead of pulling people out of the river continually, walking downstream and figuring out who's pushing them in, so to speak. How are these forms of risk getting created that put people in harm's way? How is knowledge about risk systematically produced, but also hidden and concealed from the public view? And all of these things were sort of in the back of my mind as I undertook the project I'm going to talk about today. So the project today, as Esther said, the talk today is about development responsibility and the creation of flood risk in Calgary. This comes out of 2 specific articles I've written, and if you want to hunt them down, this is how you would do that. The first one was published earlier this fall in the journal City and Community, which is an urban sociology journal with a similar title to today's talk. The link is right there, but later on, I can also put it in the chat. I don't have access to the chat right now, so I can put it in the chat later. And then just a few days ago, a more sort of popular press, less academic-y version came out in the conversation as well. So you can find that as well by Googling the title. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of background, quite a bit more than is actually in these 2 articles, especially the latter of the 2. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of how I came to this and what some of the theoretical orientations to this work are. After the flood in 2013, I started seeing a lot of advertising popping up around Calgary for new housing, for new communities. And a lot of them were advertising access to the river, riverfront walkouts, walkout units as an amenity, right? As a quality of life feature in these new communities. But to have a riverfront walkout, you've also got to have some fairly close proximity to rivers. And with my experiences in Hurricane Katrina and the Southern Alberta Flood, I've come to view rivers as a hazard, of course, as many of us do in the disaster and risk space. So I started doing more research into some of these new communities. Here I have an advertisement for a new community called Riverstone, which is in the Cranston neighborhood of Calgary. And you'll notice that in their advertisements they're putting out, the river features prominently as a landmark within that community. But one of the first things I started doing is going to Calgary's regulatory flood maps and looking at where these new neighborhoods exist. And you'll notice that at the bottom here, we have a screen capture from the flood map. You'll notice that we're not having new building going on in designated floodway areas. In fact, in 2014, new construction in floodways was outlawed, was banned. But new construction does go ahead in the flood fringe area, which you can see in orange. And this is not to pick on this particular community, Riverstone by Cranston. This is going on all over Calgary. It's going on all over Canada. And it's going on all over the world, that new construction of residential properties goes on in designated flood-prone areas. And I wanted to understand more about that. One of the ways that I had to do that, which I'll talk about in a little while, is I was already undertaking a project to survey and then to interview residents who had been affected by the 2013 flood. So not to give away too much of the punchline, but I wanted to know what they thought about these new forms of development in close proximity to rivers. Okay. So the community I just mentioned, Riverstone, which is in Calgary's Cranston neighborhood on the banks of the Bow River, this is how it's talked about by Brookfield Residential, so by the developer, as well as by CalBridge Homes, which is the builder. So it's marketed as a one-of-a-kind community on the edge of the Bow River that features a beautiful natural escape, thoroughly designed streetscapes, and stunning views all within city limits. The community is surrounded by 360 acres of environmental reserve with lots backing onto green space and Fish Creek Park. So marketing it as being very bucolic and having those opportunities for recreation that we all want. Buying a home in Riverstone means, quote, getting everything you want without sacrifice. And I put the underline in, the underline wasn't originally there, but without sacrifice. So one of the things that gets talked about in the sort of urban risk creation, political economy literature is the way that risks are talked about and minimized and so on. And some of this language could be seen as minimizing the risks, saying without sacrifice. Thanks to flood mitigation projects going on nearby, we learn your family can safely enjoy all the advantages of living beside the beautiful Bow River year-round without concerns. Though that statement about concerns was later removed. In 2019, it was on the website and it isn't anymore. But nevertheless, it was at one point. So without concerns. So in other words, making people feel comfortable about living in the shadow of the Bow River is crucial, apparently, to selling these properties. And again, it's not to pick on them. There are many developers who are doing communities like this in close proximity to rivers. Okay, like I said, Riverstone ain't alone. These are the two left pictures anyway, are pictures I took in Calgary's Quarry Park neighborhood. Just past these signs, kind of where you see the tree line there in those pictures, that's where the Bow River is. So we're talking about a relatively flat area on the bank of the Bow River where new residential development is going in. Custom home sites, we see 13 opportunities for riverfront living. And then you see down here at the bottom, the marketing of some of these units. We've taken the standard features of a basement and moved them upstairs where they belong, amidst high ceilings and expansive windows. I'm going to skip down a little bit. We've considered every detail to bring you the best value on your home. They're located steps from the Bow River in the attractive community of Quarry Park. So again, using that river access as a way to market it as being attractive to people. And Calgary isn't alone either. I just clipped these from various news outlets, but the left one talks about a flooded community that had been built in Montreal, I believe it was. On the bottom, an article from US News Report about building and development in flood-prone areas where it talks specifically about Myrtle Beach and Houston. And then on the right, debate over this is from 2019, debate over a new subdivision being built in Maple Ridge, so Vancouver area, with similar concerns and similar debate going on around it. So in thinking about all of this back in about 2015, 2016 or so, I had a number of questions. So I wanted to know, how do residents living in flood-prone areas attribute responsibility for the creation of risk and the protection of residents from flood risk? How do these residents view developers and the local municipal government? Despite Albertans normally preferring a low tax, low regulation political climate, will flood affected residents ask for more regulation of industry? And here I mean the development and home building industries. And do residents favor or oppose requirements that real estate agents and or developers disclose a home's location in a flood-prone area to potential home buyers? And or to what extent do they prefer structural mitigation efforts? So the building of dams, levees, flood walls, and so on to hold back water. All right. I came into this with a number of sort of assumptions, but I don't think they're unfounded assumptions. A lot of them come from the literature on risk, on hazards, on urban political economy, and so on. I came in assuming that urban spaces aren't static, that they're constantly changing, that land is being bought and sold and developed in new ways, that urban dwellers navigate and live in a continually changing landscape of hazards and risks, and rivers are not the only urban hazards that we have. Of course, there's a number of other ones, from landfills to industrial facilities to fault lines. I see that you guys at ICLR have done some talks. It might have been the last one you did on earthquake risk. We live in a continually changing landscape of hazards and risks. That hazardscape, as it's often called, doesn't evolve and take shape by happenstance. Rather, land use and development decisions are intentional and are done by particular parties with particular motivations and vested interests. And that exposing certain urban residents to risk can be highly profitable for particular well-positioned parties. This is coming from the urban political economy literature. The more visible and knowable that these risks are, the less profitable they then become. So there's profit motive in sort of hiding or obscuring the risks or slighting them to some extent in order to discuss instead amenities and quality of life. All right. So like any academic work, first we have to look at what we actually know. Then I'll talk a little bit about what I did to sort of get at some of these issues. I was trained in urban sociology before I got into disaster research at all. So I take a framework from urban political economy. And one of my favorite works in that area is work by John Logan and Harvey Malech. And they wrote a classic essay called The City is a Growth Machine back in 1976. And it appears in their book that I'm holding right here called Urban Fortunes, The Political Economy of Place. And their basic argument is that cities have a growth elite, as they call it. And this growth elite is a network of developers, builders, real estate agents, but also municipal government, lawyers, media outlets, frankly, universities and university administrators are part of that growth elite. It's all of these parties that have a vested interest or a stake in demographic growth of that particular city. And this growth elite, they argue, encourage growth for growth's sake, even though as they sort of figure out in their book, and as a lot of research has uncovered since then, that growth doesn't tend to economically benefit the average everyday residents of the community. It does financially benefit this growth elite. These individuals and these parties are well positioned to take advantage of that growth. The method, according to Logan and Malech, that they use to push growth is incessant lobbying, manipulating, and cajoling of local government to sort of get their way, as well as discursively working to convince the public that growth will be good for them. A bigger city will be good for them. That's the sort of general thesis, although I'm condensing it down a lot from what they wrote in their original essay of the city as a growth machine. And Calgary does indeed have these growth machine dynamics. If you go back to 2013, the year of the flood, the reports like this were coming out. Exclusive video obtained by Global News reveals Calgary developers plan to control city council. And this was actually a recording that was surreptitiously taken during a closed door meeting of developers. They say developer here singular, but there were multiple developers in this meeting talking about the kinds of money that they throw at city council candidates in order to get them to adopt a pro-development agenda. And they talked about which councillors they thought were pro-development as a result of these sort of contributions and which ones they had to work on yet. This was a big deal when it hit the media outlets in Calgary, as you can imagine, because it made the democratic process to Calgarians seem a bit less democratic. These dynamics shouldn't surprise us. One of my favorite books on risk is Kathleen Tierney's book, which I'm also holding up here, called The Social Roots of Risk, Producing Disasters, Promoting Resilience. And in that book, she writes this quote, which I just love: pro-growth actors, like developers and builders, prefer to operate in environments in which they're not constrained by land use plans, zoning and code requirements, and environmental regulations. They generally oppose regulations and requirements that would add to the cost of building and infrastructure construction and maintenance, and they seek to comply only minimally with existing mandates. Second, growth machine coalitions de-emphasize the risks associated with places and spaces, focusing instead on the amenities provided by these locations, as you saw in the previous slide. So this is getting at some of these growth machine dynamics that go on, and in fact that go on in Calgary, but I don't think Calgary is different than most cities in that sense. What else do we know? There's a literature on the role of developers in urban spaces. Clement and Elliott in an article I really like write that pro-growth actors work to what they call capture local political officials and work to undercut existing environmental protections. Grant in 2009, this is a long time ago now, but Grant writes that developers basically, quote, set the agenda in Calgary in terms of their power and influence. And indeed, I don't have these numbers for the recent election. We just had a municipal election in Calgary in October, and I don't have the numbers for this. This is from the previous one, the 2017 election. These were the successfully elected council candidates and mayor in 2017. And you'll notice their total campaign disclosure here in the second column. Third column, you'll notice the amount of that total campaign disclosure that was contributed by developers, and then the percentage in the final column that was contributed by developers. It's from a low of about, what, 4% for one successful council candidate Our former mayor, Nikki Nenshi, is at 8%, so one of the lowest. But to a high of what, 60, 70, 72% for one candidate's campaign funds came from developers. And you'll notice that our current mayor that we just elected in 2021, Jody Gondek, in the previous council election, 2017, received about half of her total campaign contributions from developers. So this gets at, I think, to some extent, the amount of influence that developers attempt to wield. I'm not saying that any of these politicians are, you know, in bed with developers and are pushing a development agenda because of the money coming to their campaigns from developers, but it is something I think to keep an eye on in our city and in all cities. I think that's about all I wanted to say about that. It's not particularly surprising if you're familiar with sort of this urban political economy literature and literature on development. Okay. There's also a number of other works that sort of talk about this. Logan and Crowder in 2002 use a growth machine framework, and they write about what they call cities as hegemonic growth regimes. Something that's hegemonic is so powerful, so dominant that we don't even question it. And this growth regime, this growth elite pushing growth for growth's sake in urban spaces, they refer to it as being hegemonic because there are very few voices that question that. And in these growth regimes, they write that the most active groups, this would be the developers, home builders, real estate, and so on, favors growth and pushes for growth. That won't surprise you. But all others, including civil society groups, so this would be, you know, nonprofits and community associations and things like that, are either pro-growth or they're neutral on the topic. But there are very, very few organizations that voice dissent about this in these places, in these hegemonic growth regimes. Okay, continuing on. One of the things that hasn't been asked very often in the academic literature is what do residents think of developments going in close to hazards, of risky developments. I put it's a severely understudied area because I was, quite frankly, when I did that article, the more academic one, the city and community one, I was shocked how little had been written about this area. We know much more about resident views on the building of tourism infrastructure. That's a very common area of inquiry. We know more about resident views on transit development, as well as resident views on sports facilities and the construction of sports facilities, including Shearer's book in 2016, which looks at, among other things, building of the hockey arena in Edmonton. But not housing going in close to hazards. That's not a very common area of inquiry. Why? Well, there is work showing us how resident views are often cast by those in government, but also those in industry as being uninformed or overly emotional, meaning they're often discounted. And because they're often discounted, I think they're not asked that often, even by researchers, what they think about these forms of development. Residents, we know, and what we do know, residents support development, generally speaking, although again, it's not true everywhere, it's a generalization, but they hold negative appraisals of developers. And this will be important for us later as we get into some of my findings. And the residents feel excluded from conversations about development. Well, that won't surprise you if you look 2 lines above when those parties who are making development decisions cast residents as being uninformed or overly emotional. Not surprisingly, those residents feel excluded from those spaces and those discussions. Homeowners generally understand their property rights as being absolute, meaning I own this parcel of property and can do whatever I want with it, and therefore resist limitations on the use of those particular properties. And that residents hold expectations that government will work to protect their property values, that's one of the roles of government. And again, this will all come back to be important for us in a few minutes. What else do we know? Down to the bottom, you see, just from the other day, from late October, you see construction on long-awaited Springbank Dam and reservoir to protect Calgary area from floods is officially go. And in fact, we're breaking ground on this right now, just west of Calgary. There's a schematic of what it's going to look like. And the reason I'm talking about the Springbank Dam right now is that there is a literature out there on the sort of hegemony or the power of of structural mitigation activities. These are the large sort of mega projects, the levees, dams, flood walls, pumping stations, things like that. There tends to be a resident preference for, but especially an official preference for, the building of these structural mitigation projects. Not to mention property level flood mitigation practices, which I know ICLR is really heavily involved in, and that is wonderful. I would never be one to criticize property level flood mitigation practices. So things like the backwater preventers and so on, that's important. It's not what I'm talking about necessarily today, but I'm not saying that that's not a valuable thing to do. Those sorts of things tend to be preferred by residents and officials together. This, according to Dennis Milletti, reflects the idea that people can use technology to control nature and to make themselves safe. And we're going to interrogate this a little bit more later in my talk as we talk about some of my findings. This is also the approach favored by the growth lobby, and there is some research there, this growth elite or growth machine that we talked about earlier. Structural mitigation is generally the preferred approach. And we know that structural mitigation can and does decrease aggregate flood damage, and that's good. But other methods, according to Samuel Brody, other methods have been proven just as, if not more effective for reducing aggregate flood damage. And that, again, is all foreshadowing what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, these other methods. The key question then is, should we try, this is more of a philosophical question, is it better to try to keep water away from people and property? Or should we be focusing our attention on keeping the people and the property away from the water? And the actual answer, of course, lies somewhere in between, but the question is how much of each and where is that balance? I'm a social scientist. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a hydrologist, but I think the social sciences have a lot to contribute to this discussion, because once you get past the actual risk assessments, the actual construction of flood maps, a lot of what we're talking about is it relates to our values and our ethics and our priorities and all of these things that are inherently social, not purely technical or purely scientific. Okay, I believe this is the last slide of what we know already. There is an approach originating out of Northern Europe in particular. It's known as a Dutch approach, but other Northern European countries have tried it, known as the room for the river approach, whereby you essentially leave land close to the river undeveloped to give the river room for seasonal flooding and so on. It has been discussed in the academic literature as a possible strategy that we could incorporate in the Alberta context. Eva Bogdan and colleagues wrote about that in 2020. It focuses not just on what I mentioned before, but on a combination of limiting development near rivers, which we'll talk more about today, buyouts of existing properties, which we've done some of in Alberta following the 2013 flood, structural mitigation where appropriate, and generally the preservation of green space as an amenity. So being a little bit more thoughtful about how and where we allow development and what it means to allow development in close proximity to a hazard. Room for the river approaches get better resident buy-in, it's been found, when they're framed as gains. So when you talk about the amenities, as we already do, I talked about that earlier, when you talk about the amenities they provide, not the loss. In other words, we're not doing it because of fear of flooding. That doesn't tend to get the kind of buy-in that talking about leaving parks and green spaces near rivers undeveloped, that will get better buy-in. Residents have preferences for environmental preservation, and that's directly related to the proximity to water. So there's ways that this can be sold, these approaches can be sold to the public if we're careful about how we discursively frame them, and if we keep in mind resident preferences and priorities for green space and for environmental preservation. Now I'm talking about this in the Alberta context. And Alberta has a very unique and specific context, as those of you who are watching from within Canada probably know already. In 2013, the Bow and the Elbow rivers, among others in southern Alberta, overtopped their banks, causing the evacuation of 75,000 people, and it was eventually a $6 billion disaster. This happens within a context in which Alberta accounts for 60% of Canada's total disaster damage since 2010. Alberta has only about 10% or so of Canada's population, but we account for 60% of the disaster damage. That's, to me, always been really significant. And it's not reversing itself anytime soon. Alberta's projected to warm at about twice the global rate of warming, as much as 4 degrees Celsius by 2050. And to the extent that climate change is connected to more volatile events, more volatile weather events, we'll probably see more flood events in the future. The city of Calgary, following the 2013 flood, committed to and has almost spent some $318 million on flood mitigation activities. This is in the decade from 2013 to 2023. And their ambitious, sorry about the typo, I should say ambitious plans to grow the city. This is where that growth machine discussion comes in, from the current population of 1.3 million to 1.7 million by 2033, a little over 10 years away, and eventually 2.4 million by 2017. This, of course, raises discussions about whether we have not only the space, but the access to resources like water, given our dry climate and so on, to support a population that big. So I think there's bigger environmental discussions here, but these are ambitious growth plans. And that 2.4 million people is going to need to live somewhere. And Calgary is a city that is crisscrossed by its rivers. So these are discussions that we're going to have to continue having. There's also a political context in Alberta, and the political context is that Alberta is particularly prone to right-wing populism. As one can see, I'll try not to make this a criticism of our current provincial government, but as one can see in our current provincial government, Albertans tend to favor governments and political leaders capable of protecting an enviable quality of life by keeping taxes low, and they reject or eschew what they see as activist government. Albertans are ardent defenders of the sanctity of private property rights as well, which is to say they're skeptical of and don't love the idea of new land use regulations, generally speaking, compared to many other places. We also know outside of Alberta that many politically conservative communities oppose most or all regulations, fearing overreach by big government. At the same time, many of these communities see risk as just the inevitable trade-off for economic growth. So we're inserting ourselves in this discussion about risk creation within a political context that's already going to be skeptical of new regulations and so on. Okay, so what did I do? Well, here you see a picture of two of my amazing research assistants. I had a team, I'll talk about them at the end, a team of research assistants. In the end, I think about 7 who worked on this project in various capacities. Now, I should mention, I did a survey the year after the flood. So 2014, I did a survey of hundreds of Calgarians in all 26 of Calgary's flood-affected neighborhoods. The survey ended up generating a representative data set of Calgarians living in flood-affected neighborhoods. But that survey raised as many questions as it did and questions that it answered. So with the help of research assistants, especially these two, Isabel and Victoria, I embarked on a project to interview residents who had been affected by the flood as well. How did I do that? I first sent emails to community associations in the 26 flood-affected neighborhoods in Calgary in the summer of 2015, so 2 years after the flood. Community association leaders, and this could be presidents, vice presidents. Some of these community associations had a specific flood task force within their community association. So in some cases, this was the flood task force manager, forwarded the email to members of the community association. They sometimes discussed the interviews at their meetings, or they posted a sign about it in their community hall, instructing interested participants to contact me. In the end, we got 45 interested individuals who reached out by phone or email, and we were able to arrange a time and location to conduct the interview with 40 of them. We just said in our recruitment materials that you have to be flood affected, but we left that up to the participant. If that meant that they evacuated, but their home didn't flood, okay. If that meant that they lost a job because their place of employment was flooded, but their house wasn't, that's okay. But they did have to live in one of those 26 flood affected neighborhoods. In the end, though, 39 out of our 40 participants had flooded homes. 20 were men, 20 were women, so we have an even gender balance there. But they interpreted flood affected to mean that their homes were indeed flooded. We conducted interviews in fall of 2015. These are in-depth interviews generating qualitative data. So from 40 interviews, we ended up with hundreds of pages of qualitative data to analyze. Interviews took between 60 and 180 minutes, so 1 to 3 hours, average of about 90 minutes. And to thank participants, we gave them a $50 gift card to Rona to value their time. Our interviews were transcribed, so typed out by a third-party transcriptionist based in Calgary. And in our interview guide, we asked a number of questions of participants. I'm not going to read all of them, but these are some of the ones. We asked them, do you think it should mainly be the responsibility of government or individuals to protect our families and communities from flood risk? What responsibilities do you feel city governments and private developers have in regard to flood risk? And there's a lot of prompts and probes that we had when participants said, oh, I don't know, I've not really thought about that before. We had ways to follow up to get them to think about it and so on. Okay. Then we had all this data, pages and pages of data. There's a picture of the team of RAs at the bottom. This was actually the team working on the survey part of the project, but I felt like I should get them in the talk as well too, because they were part of this larger project. Once we had the transcripts, we replaced all of their names with pseudonyms, fake names. So the names you'll be seeing today are not their actual names. I then open coded them to identify themes, meaning I read all the transcripts and I looked for themes essentially. And then we used a program called In Vivo to go in and do the actual coding line by line. I did it and a student research assistant did it too, so you can ensure something called intercoder reliability. So we use a process called descriptive and pattern coding to do that. Then I used a grounded theory approach where arguments are built up through an exchange between data and existing theory and literature in the field. And essentially you build arguments from the ground up once you've observed these patterns in your data. And now I have the privilege of sharing with you some of the things that we learned about residents' perceptions of flood risk. This quote really hit home with me, and it was by a participant named Mary Jean. She said, I remember thinking about the community of Chaparral and down in that area where people are building right down in the valley. And I thought, ooh, that looks like a really dumb place to buy a house, even though I'm sure they're gorgeous houses and everything. On the bottom, you can see a couple of pictures that I took in a new community being built by the river. The one on the left, you can see the Bow River. You can see a little sliver of it. And on the right, you can see new homes that had just been constructed. Then in the one on the right, I took the picture from what is essentially the bank of the Bow River, looking at homes that have been built. And I believe these were homes that existed within that flood fringe area, the orange area on the map. Okay, so one of the things we asked was about the role of developers in creating risk, but also in keeping people safe from risk. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about what our Calgarians, what our participants thought about the role of developers. Well, they didn't believe that developers would act proactively to protect public safety unless they were required to. And this was a finding that was true almost across the board with all or most of our participants. It was a very commonly held feeling. Irene says, developers get away with a lot of shit that they shouldn't be getting away with. And that phrase, get away with a lot of shit, was really common. I was surprised how many people made comments similar to that. Many felt that developers should have a responsibility to protect the public from flood risk, but they shirk that responsibility. Mary Jean, who you heard from before, said, I think developers have a responsibility because they're the ones who are going to profit when lots are sold. So they should take the responsibility to make it less likely to flood. Then Matthew added, because the consumer won't know if a location is risky, and the developer, in some cases knows. Yeah, private developers, absolutely, they should have responsibility, but neither of them said that the developers currently took or shouldered that responsibility. They just felt that it should be something developers take on. They pointed to developers' lack of care and concern. in doing the projects that they do. Rachel says, the developers can only do what they're allowed to do. They can't build where the city says they can't. They can't build where the province says they can't. So it's not the developers, they don't give a shit. It has to be the government who says it can't be done. So she's asking for new regulations on developers that would restrict where and how they build. But there's also the other side of the coin to some extent, where participants felt that developers were sort of blameless. And I mean blameless to the extent that they viewed them as singularly focused, myopic capitalists who would only and could only be expected to focus on profit. Scott says, you can't blame the developers. They're just in there to make bucks, right? And if the city says you can build there, then bingo, they make a pile and they will. So they're blameless because that's just what developers do. In many cases, and there are many more examples of quotations in the academic article that I shared with you, the city and community one, they don't all appear here just for time's sake. They generally felt not angry about the lack of concern that developers exhibited, but more so resigned to it. That's just how developers are. It's in their nature, according to residents that I interviewed. And remind you, I put the guy shrugging because that was kind of the attitude about developers. And mind you, these are residents who had been through a major flood only 2 years earlier, but yet they weren't really angry about it, more so resigned to it. Then some of the discussion turned to the role of government. And does government have the courage to stand up to developers? So I've got my little cowardly lion here. Residents pointed to the need for floodplain regulation. Jackie says, I think they have to have legislation in place to say at some point, no developer, you can't put in a neighborhood there unless you do A, B, and C. Oops, I left the name off of that one, but one of the participants said, I think it's a mistake to buy a home by the river. The river needs room. So again, hearkening to that room for the river approach we talked about earlier, the city should not allow it. First off, it's the government's fault. I believe city government allowed that development to occur and the developers did it. So I'm very unhappy about that. They viewed government, generally speaking, and this is primarily municipal government we're talking about because they have the most role in in allowing or regulating floodplain development. They viewed the government as weak and ineffectual. Gary says the government needs to have the balls to say no, and most of them won't. It's all about money. So he specifically refers to their lack of fortitude or lack of ability or willingness to stand up to developers. And Scott says to hell with the developer, and that's what the government has to do, to hell with the developer. So they felt strongly that government was not doing their job to protect the needs of citizens, of home buyers, of residents, and so on, by not standing up to developers. And again, many times they talked about the money in that role. And we looked earlier at campaign contributions to successful council candidates by developers, and residents are not unaware of that. They talk about that. They talked about that frequently. They viewed government as in bed with developers and as influenced by the money. So Lila says, residents want restrictions on because residents want restrictions on development, ignoring the will of the people, government, she felt, is therefore, and this is her quote, negligent in their responsibility to citizens. Matthew says developers can't develop in places where it's just going to be torn down in 50 years or even 100 years. Think about it. And government, they should help. They should tell private developers, maybe, laughing. He laughed at the end of his comment. And it's interesting because there's a literature within my field, sociology, on the meaning of laughter. And laughter can happen because people are uncomfortable with the discussion. That happened in many of the conversations in the interviews I had when I asked about issues regarding climate change. A lot of people laughed. They would deny climate change, deny that it's either happening or that it's anthropogenic, human caused. And then they would laugh at the end and sometimes say things like, you must think I'm a nut bar, and things like that, meaning they sort of knew it was not the scientific consensus and could be perceived as a little bit crazy, but they were uncomfortable in that situation, so they laughed. Here, though, it has a slightly different meaning, I think. To me, that laughter might mean that he felt his own suggestion was not feasible. So he says they should tell private developers, maybe. He even adds in the maybe, like, he's uncertain about it, but then he laughs saying, I don't think that's going to happen. So how unrealistic his own ideas are that municipal government would stand up to developers and limit development near rivers. They felt the government has the best information, and because they have the best information, they have a moral responsibility to act. Nancy says, at least they're aware. I mean, if the information is there, I don't think they should be developing there. Frank says they should control that and say, if you're going to allow a developer to develop a whole neighborhood on a floodplain or in a swamp, then yeah, they should pay for it, I think, because it never should have been allowed. So again, it's that moral responsibility to act and what should happen, not to mention how unrealistic they think it is that that's actually going to happen. Now, one of the things that I asked about in most of these cases, but even when I didn't, the discussion went there fairly often, was the need to inform home buyers about a home's location in a floodway or a flood fringe. Now, here you see on the bottom right, a document from the Real Estate Council of Alberta, and it's laying out what you might call best practices for real estate with regard to flood hazard areas. And you'll notice they lay it out where they say, search the seller's property in the flood hazard map application, print it, show it to the person, inquire about previous flooding incidents, and so on and so forth. In Alberta, however, it is not a requirement that real estate agents disclose a home's location in a floodplain. It's considered a best practice. It is not required currently. So one of the things we talked about was whether that requirement made sense or not. There was a general agreement among participants that home buyers should be made aware of location in a flood-prone area. I say general agreement because it wasn't a full-on agreement. Angela says, there should be total disclosure. You know, if I was to sell my house, we would tell people that, yeah, the city flooded in 2013. I think it's the responsibility of realtors to make sure that people buy and know what they're getting into. And Angela says, realtors should not just say that it's in a flood fringe, for instance, but explain what it means. Tasha says, I only knew I was in a floodplain. And then after the flood, I was told I was in a flood fringe, and I never, ever heard that word in my life. I've lived here for 42 years and I've never heard the word flood fringe ever. So maybe realtors should be more upfront about that. This is zone floodplain and this is zone flood fringe and so on. This actually speaks specifically, I think, to a lot of work that's been done by like Jason Thistlethwaite and folks out at University of Waterloo who've done, they did a great report in 2017 on Canadian Voices on Changing Flood Risk. And one of the things they found is that a lot of Canadians who live in flood-prone areas do not know they live in flood-prone areas or have only vague understandings of that. So I think that this really speaks to that knowledge gap still. And many people felt that realtors should work to bridge that knowledge gap with homebuyers. There was some objection, like I mentioned before, not everybody agreed about this requirement. Brian says, so disclosure laws are pretty clear right now. You can't sell a flooded property to somebody and not tell them. To tell them about future risk is kind of like, well, this house might burn down. That tree could fall on you. This could flood again. So buyer beware, they should know that they're buying on a flood fringe. So in other words, because risk is predictive, you can't inform people about it and you shouldn't really be trying. You can inform people about past flooding incidents and you should, but you can't really inform people about what's going to happen in the future was his position. Now, the real estate industry in the United States has actually called mandatory informer requirements idiotic and believes that they would, quote, kill the market. And again, this gets back to what I talked about earlier, that knowledge about risk and discussions about risk are not ultimately very good for property values. So the money is in concealing these risks. Then we get into taking personal responsibility. So what we've talked about so far are the participants who said government needs to do a better job regulating developers and real estate needs to be required to inform people about risk. But not all participants felt this way. There were some who took a buyer beware position on this. And I would also argue that this buyer beware standpoint was disproportionately taken by men that I interviewed. There was a significant, not significant in this just statistical sense, but a noticeable gender difference here. Caleb says, Well, I think people can live wherever they want. Again, hearkening back to this notion of freedom and private property, but I think they have to carry that risk. Brian says, even discussing the issue is really fraught with problems because it harkens back to private property. It's really nobody's responsibility to protect people from flooding except for their own, presumably. And so again, we should all be responsible for ourselves is the position that they're taking. And you need to do your due diligence if you buy a property to make sure to figure out whether it's flooded before and figure out whether it's in a designated flood area. I'm going to talk about common sense because they brought up the notion of common sense a lot. I will say sociologists like me are very critical of the even existence of common sense because common sense, we argue, is a product of socialization and we're each socialized in a different way and it's culturally and contextually very specific. So I often reject the notion that anything, quite frankly, is commonsensical. And there's a great book on that here by Duncan Watts, a sociologist, called Everything is Obvious, Once You Know the Answer, How Common Sense Fails Us. But my participants did not share that view that I share as a sociologist. They believed in, at least this group of them, the personal responsibility group, believed in the presence of common sense. So flood risk and buying a home in a flood-prone area, they felt should be common sense. Caleb, who you heard from before, said, people have to take some responsibility for themselves. You can't just go in totally blind and say, I know there's a river here, but I'm going to build anyways. You got to have some common sense. Rachel says it should be instinctual. And William says, it has to be in the back of your mind that it could happen. So these are things that if you're close to a river are just natural to think about. They're things that people have to consider. And and the implication here is if people buy or build near a river and are not thinking about this stuff, well, that's on them because they should have thought about it. So that's the taking responsibility group. The taking responsibility group also had a significant sub part of it, a number of people who felt that, quite frankly, one of the reasons we have to take personal responsibility is that we've already made our bed. This is a done deal. We've committed ourselves and have built in floodplains in Calgary. It's over. Tasha says, there's not a lot of land left in Calgary where we might say that is a vulnerable area and you should not live in it. So the dirty deed has been done. This is despite the fact, mind you, that there are still developments being built today in flood-prone areas of this city and many cities. Gary says, Regina, built on a river. Saskatoon, built on a river. Edmonton, built on a river. Vancouver, built on the ocean. Tuktoyaktuk, built on the ocean. Those are the natural trade routes that go back hundreds of years, and that is why they are there. Alan adds to that saying, it's not just Calgary, it's everywhere that people live in disaster areas. You can't change that. It's a durable feature of our cities. And we've already done it in Calgary. We've built on the riverbanks and now we have to sort of deal with the consequences of that. Thinking about things like buyouts. One of the things that sociologists and disaster researchers are increasingly writing about is the notion of managed retreat. So these sort of collective, more participatory, bottom-up approaches to buyouts and to moving people out of harm's way. Liz Kozlov does amazing work on this with her article, her 2016 article, The Case for Retreat. And I gather that she has a book coming out on this topic too. She was writing about flood-prone residents in New York and New Jersey after Hurricane Sandy. Participants in the study, especially in this It's Too Late camp, felt that this was unrealistic. Peter said, half the city is built on a riverbank, so you're not going to force all those people to pack up and move. Edward says, Calgary downtown, headquarters of major national and international companies, is in a floodplain of a river. I can't imagine what cost it would be to the city, to the local economy, to the provincial economy, to the national economy, if nobody was allowed to live in a floodplain, if no major businesses were allowed to operate in the floodplain. I don't think you could do it, frankly. And many of us, of course, would sympathize with that. You're not going to move the downtown of a major city, but there's also, many places where buyouts are done to move people out of harm's way. And in fact, after the 2013 flood, the province of Alberta did a handful of buyouts in High River and a handful of buyouts in Calgary as well. So this is something that we have done, but this particular group of participants wasn't really thrilled about the notion of buyouts or managed retreat. So What about engineering away the risk? There's these structural mitigations that we talked about. Well, across the groups I talked about before, whether you're talking about the pro-regulation group, whether you're talking about the personal responsibility group, there was a general consensus, I think, that structural mitigations are good and need to be done. So they talked about walls a lot. Nicole said, I think it would be a very good idea if money would be invested better on some kind of flood-proof wall. Emily said, we can keep building in floodplains, but we need to make it higher, make it safer, whatever. Put up the concrete walls or whatever you need to do to make it safe. If you really wanted to sell that for development, make it safe, or make the developers make it safe. So again, it's expressing that confidence that structural mitigations will allow us to continue developing and living in floodplains, because they will hold back the water and keep us safe. So back to that debate about, do we keep people and property away from the water or try to keep the water away from the people? Well, these folks seem to be siding on the side of keep the water away from the people. They talked a lot about building houses on stilts and raising houses that are close to the rivers. Dave says the government should have a lot to say about that. That's why we get building permits. That's why we get development permits. So there should be, I think, so if you're going to build a house here, you got to build it on stilts. It might not look nice, but I mean, that's the kind of thing we almost have to do. Jocelyn says, I think it makes more sense to put in really well-designed homes and go bigger than you ever thought possible. Make it so that you can't even have a ground floor, or just like parking under your house where the house is up on stilts and the car goes underneath. They also talk frequently about perhaps we should be regulating development of new houses so that we're not putting in basements. They thought it, one participant referred to it as insane that you have houses close to a river that have basements. So to sum up there, they expressed some confidence, I think, in the ability to engineer away our flood risk, unlike scholars we talked about earlier, like Dennis Milletti, who says that it expresses human confidence in our ability to control nature in ways he implies that perhaps we shouldn't be confident. And again, my perspective from that comes from the experience of going through Hurricane Katrina, one of the most massive failures of an engineered flood protection system to ever occur. So conclusion-wise, what have we learned? Well, most participants across the board did not believe that developers would act to protect public safety unless they were required to do so. They were not particularly angry about it, but more resigned to it, believing that this is just in the nature of developers to focus on profit, not public safety. Residents tended to take a couple then preferred approaches. There was one group, and I'm not going to say there wasn't any movement or overlap between the groups, but there tended to be two fairly distinct groups. In the first group, a number of participants I interviewed wanted to regulate floodplain development, so tell developers you can't build here, and require disclosure of existing home locations, so where realtors are required to disclose a home's location in a flood fringe area. There was a second group who was the buyer beware group, who felt that, look, we've already committed ourselves. Now it's just got to be on the individual to do your due diligence and figure out if you're buying a house on a floodplain. Those individuals need to take personal responsibility, but quite frankly, it's too little too late to stop the construction of homes on floodplains. Then there was, I put group 1 plus group 2 overlap, because across the board, whether the folks were in group 1 or group 2, there was a preference, or they voiced a desire to enhance structural protections. So things like the Springbank Dam and reservoir, which are being built right now. Flood-proof walls, they called it. I'm not sure what they meant by that, if they meant walls along the river in the sort of, levee or flood wall sense. I'm not really sure what they meant by that, but these enhanced structural protections were something that were favored. And that's not a surprise, given the literature in that area, that many residents do in fact prefer and want and advocate for enhanced structural protections. There was a lack of agreement on the best approach and what we should do. This, I think, will limit residents' collective voice in influencing government in one way or another to take a particular route, because residents don't seem to agree with themselves on what we should be doing. And this follows a literature showing that even when residents are organized and there's a general consensus about what needs to be done to mitigate risk, advocating to government can still be challenging and fraught with problems. That's under the best case scenario when there's consensus. But here in Calgary, there does not seem to be that consensus that I gathered. So I think that's going to limit residents' collective voice in this process. So this research, I hope, helps us understand in hegemonic growth regimes, how growth consensus is sort of created and maintained, and more broadly, just what people think about the best course of action to keep people safe from flood risk. So to back up a bit, risk is proliferating in North American cities, and new neighborhoods are being planned and built in proximity to rivers. That's just the empirical reality. I picked this one off the web. This is a neighborhood called the Waterways of Muskoka from Ontario, and it's very similar to how these new communities are being marketed in Calgary too, as being, you know, the sort of peaceful, bucolic living with close access to the environment, right on the waterway, with riverfront walkout units and so on. So it's not just Calgary, it's all over the place that these sorts of developments are going in. The growth machine in these places pushes for unabated development and growth because it is in their financial interest to do so. It's important, I think, to analyze the politics and motivations of property owners and of residents during normal times, but then, of course, also in situations of risk. This is further complicated, though, in conservative communities, ones like Calgary, although Calgary is a mixed bag, but in places like Calgary and in Alberta, which tend to reject increased government regulations and what they see as an activist government, and where property rights are viewed as sacrosanct, so need to be protected at all costs. So managing risk, I argue, requires a shift in thinking. This comes from Ted Steinberg's work on the Mississippi River, and it's a quote from the mayor of the town of Chelsea, Iowa from the 1990s, and I just really like it. And the mayor of the town said, "It used to be that we managed the river and let people go where they want to. Now we're trying to manage the people and letting the river go where it wants to." So because this came from the Mississippi, I couldn't not share my favorite quote about the Mississippi River from you. I know some of you have heard this quote over and over, so I apologize, but it comes from Mark Twain, who wrote, "One who knows the Mississippi will promptly aver, not aloud, but to himself, that 10,000 river commissions with the minds of the world at their back, so all of the people and resources and that you could imagine, cannot tame that lawless stream, cannot curb or confine it, cannot say to it, go here or go there and make it obey, cannot save a shore which it has sentenced, cannot bar its path with an obstruction which it will not tear down, dance over, and laugh at." Again, this gets at my own skepticism about large structural mitigation mega projects and engineered flood protection systems. But nevertheless, I always like this quote about dancing over it and laughing at it. Kozlov, who I cite a lot, talks about resistance adaptation. So instead of trying to conquer nature in various ways, modifying human activities to adapt to a changing climate, and that is actually a form of resistance. And she argues, in terms of her managed retreat approach, that there's nothing defeatist about retreat, that sometimes retreat is the most noble approach. So the quote that I end my article in City and Community on is, I say, the first step in getting out of a hole is to stop digging, meaning that we're headed into a world where flood losses are going to mount. And we continue to densify, to add houses, and to build new developments close to rivers. All of that is locking in these future flood losses in ways that we don't have to be doing. So the first way to sort of begin protecting ourselves from flood risk is to stop creating new flood risk. And so that's my sort of argument that I end with, and it's not probably the position of a lot of people and parties within my own community, but that is what I think needs to be done. So with that, I will take questions here in a moment, but I also need to say some thanks. So I had a team of amazing research assistants who helped with both the survey part of the project that I didn't talk about today and the interview part of the project that I did talk about today. Their names are right here. I had 407 survey participants, and that survey kind of gave birth to the interviews, for which I had 40 interview participants. And I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the funder for this work. The project was funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, or SSHRC, and it would not be possible without them. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you have, or any discussion that you want to have.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Haney. That was so informative. I think case studies are so important in understanding risk perception in different contexts. So thank you for that contribution. I think we'll start with a comment actually from one of the attendees to you. She's saying she is a registered professional planner and just absolutely appreciated your presentation. So, and she also welcomes your insight and accept that her profession continues to enable and support human settlement in high hazard areas. And engineers and planners need to be held accountable. And so good governance equals accountability, transparency, and equity. So Professor Haney, that's just, some more encouragement for you. The growth machine thesis seems unlikely since housing shortages are a major problem for major cities today, with NIMBYism and the prevalence of single-family detached zoning showing the limited political influence of developers. And in particular, just to clarify, 67% of residential land in Calgary is zoned for detached single-family homes. And so he's asking, would these obstacles to densification be an alternative explanation for development in riskier regions given the increased demand for living in cities due to network effects?
That's a great question. I don't know that I necessarily share the premise of that question, where the growth machine thesis seems unlikely since housing shortages are a major problem. Rather, the need for housing, it drives up housing costs, generally speaking, and makes housing and development more profitable. And the more profitable it is, the more developers and builders are going to try to influence to allow more of it. So I don't necessarily think that that's the case. Usually in cities with high demand for housing and with housing shortages, that's actually when you tend to see the most vocal growth coalitions. So whether that's true in Calgary or not, I don't particularly know how atypical we are, nor do I know what conversations go on that I'm not privy to. So I can't really speak to that too much, but yeah, so I don't really share that premise there. And I'm looking at the comment and I'm going to see if I can piece apart the rest of it. With NIMBYism and the prevalence of single-family detached zoning showing the limited political influence of developers. Yeah, I have not seen that limited political influence of developers. In fact, Calgary gets written about as a place in which developers very much set the agenda. So again, don't think I agree with the premise. With these obstacles to densification, yeah, and that's a debate that we've been having in Calgary for more than a decade now about densification. And I focused specifically on the construction of newer communities close to the river, but that's the other thing that I think we need to look at is there's also a lot of densification going on, particularly infill development, where housing is rezoned to allow the demolition of an existing house, usually like a 1960s bungalow kind of house, and the construction of often two houses, if not more, if not a larger sort of development in its place. One of the things that does is it increases the density in existing communities close to the river. Now, from an urban sprawl kind of standpoint, I love densification. I think it's fantastic. From a flood risk standpoint, to the extent it goes on in river adjacent communities, then I tend to have more concerns about it. So densification is certainly an issue, and that also, it puts more people close to the rivers, which can increase aggregate flood losses as well. Could it be an alternative explanation for development in riskier regions? Due to network effects? Yeah, potentially. That question has a lot of due to this, due to that. So it's really sort of hard to follow the logical sequence. I'm doing the best I can. I think the answer is both, right? I think developers are politically very influential. I also think that a lot of development is getting driven as well by these pushes for densification and so on that are going on. And many of those are city government led. I mean, we had a mayor for a decade who was very much pro rezoning, pro infill, pro densification. And so I think the push for these kinds of developments close to the river can come from multiple places at the same time. Sorry, that's kind of the best answer I have there.
Thank you for that. That's very good. We have another question actually concerning Calgary specifically. Calgary put in flood risk mitigation measures post 2013. They're relying on these to protect the homes being built in river adjacent areas.
Yeah, so my understanding is that the ones that the city of Calgary did are trying to protect homes being built in river adjacent areas, and developers have a requirement to do things like certain mitigation activities too when they put in new homes. So to make sure that they're raised up a little bit, or to use what are considered best construction practices for keeping homes safe. As well, there have been a number of mitigation projects going on. The big one, the Springbank Dam, is a Government of Alberta project, though it's not a City of Calgary project. So there's activities going on both at the municipal level and the provincial level. Since the 2013 flood, a number of people have installed the backflow preventers, and there was various subsidies available to do that. And so a lot of people in existing flood prone neighborhoods, whether it be Inglewood or Bridgeland or Hillhurst, Sunnyside or Bowness, a number of people have put those in. So probably our community is safer from flood risk, generally speaking, now than we were in 2013. And that's what I'm saying. I'm not anti structural mitigation either, but I think there also needs to be a conversation about continued new developments near rivers. And what I noticed was there wasn't that conversation going on. It was full speed ahead, which you would expect given the growth machine thesis and other work in the area. So I think having the social and political and economic discussion, that needs to happen, but usually the discussion gets reduced to the scientific or technical or engineered discussion. And I think both discussions need to happen. And it's great when multiple parties and stakeholders can have those discussions in the same room. It doesn't often happen.
Thank you. Just curious, one of the attendees wants to find out whether you're aware of the multi-point foundations. Usually they raise buildings 3 feet off the ground. Just curious.
Not necessarily called that, but of course I'm familiar with homes being raised, at least 3 feet for that purpose, but not multi-point foundation specifically. Again, I focus my attention on people and what people think, and less so on the engineering aspect of it. But as a disaster researcher, I can't ignore the engineering aspect of it either. So no, but thank you, Peter, for putting the link in the chat, and I will check it out afterwards.
Yes, thanks, Peter. Now we have some questions that are specifically related to the research findings. So how did the group who felt it was buyer beware to live in the floodplain feel about the role of government support post-flooding?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. That's a great question, Erica. Generally, they seem to want, like I talked about, that limited government role in their lives. And felt that it was the role of government to protect their private property rights and their home values. And beyond that, not a lot of role of government. So the idea was sort of let builders and developers build what they're going to build, where they want to build it. But that group also generally, again, there's various overlaps, but they generally felt that we already sort of done it. So now it's just buyer beware. We've already committed ourselves. So now we just have to be cautious consumers when we buy houses, but it's up to us as individuals. They saw a very small role for government in any of this discussion.
Thanks. We also have another question.
Actually, I didn't answer that very well. Sorry. Government support post-flooding. Do you mean government aid programs like in Alberta, we have the disaster recovery program, DRP? Are you talking about government assistance programs? Erica might have been talking about that. And if that's the case, they didn't really talk about it, quite honestly. That didn't come up very often. What did come up in the interviews across the board was a general frustration with Alberta's DRP, disaster recovery program. People talking about the fact that, I lost a $350,000 house and the DRP offers me $25,000. How is that going to get me back on my feet? That sort of thing. DRP sort of became a swear word in the interviews. where people were very upset about it. Now, how did the buyer beware group talk about that in relation to the other sort of more pro-government regulation group? I don't know. I haven't looked at that. My sense is they probably just mostly didn't talk about it because their perspective was that government needs to back out of the way and let individuals make choices for themselves.
Thank you. Again, attendee just commenting that these questions, research questions, were really very timely and important, and just asking that whether you can speak to the requirement to raise the land in these new communities built in the flood fringe, so they will no longer be flooded during a 1 in 100 flood.
Yep, I'm also reading the
rest of it.
Can I speak to the requirements? Not specifically, I've consulted the requirements as part of the project, but don't have
Sure.
them in front of me. I would say no. To the last question, was there an awareness or recognition of this practice with your study participants? I would say no. And I want to point out, this is a very special group. It's a group that has been flooded. So they maybe don't share the same views as the rest of Calgarians who have not necessarily experienced a flood. Was there recognition of the practice of, for example, raising the land or raising homes in these communities? No, they didn't talk about that necessarily. They did seem to voice a trust generally in structural and engineering efforts to engineer away flood risk. But I think I can say they did not feel like that was enough, that the government regulation group also felt like government should step in and be a little bit more proactive in telling developers that even if you're going to mitigate this in some way, we still don't want you developing right there. And they felt like government would not do that, would not have that conversation with developers, that some land is just really off limits.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to just get at the specific questions here and shorten it for you. From your findings, municipal land use decisions and realtor disclosure seems like key findings. These seem like key findings. Have you explored pathways to implementation?
How do I want to answer that? No, I'm not quite there yet, I would say. So I think, yes, in the back of my head, I'm exploring it. In actual written research, I'm not. So one of the things that I want to do, this work just came out. One of the things that I want to do, now that we have a new municipal government in Calgary, is I want to have a discussion with them about this work and sort of see where they approach the development issue from. And maybe I'm really naive, but I would like to just have that discussion. The other thing that I really want to do is I really want to have a multi-party research project, a multi-stakeholder research project, where we also talk with municipal government, developers, real estate industry, to figure out how they think about and envision and plan for risk. Because I think, getting the resident standpoint, that's an understudied area, like I pointed out earlier, and that's important, but it's not the only piece of the puzzle, right? This is a multi-stakeholder issue. And in fact, many of the participants said, these are my views, but I think these discussions have to go on in multi-stakeholder environments where all these parties can talk to one another and we can arrive at some kind of consensus about what permissible levels of risk are. And those discussions, they didn't feel like were happening. They felt excluded from the conversation. And that came out, as you saw in some of the quotations, where they just said, the government has to stand up to developers. Right now, developers do whatever they want, was sort of the perspective that many of them took. So not surprising, given the literature showing that residents do feel excluded in other places as well from discussions about risk and development.
And Professor, are you aware of research which asks similar questions of developers, municipal officials, or other members of the growth machine?
A little bit here in pockets. I would say most of the sort of growth machine urban development work looks at, like I mentioned earlier, development in relation to transit is a big one, in relation to sort of sports facilities. I forget what the other example, like, oh, tourism infrastructure. For some reason, housing just doesn't really get looked at that much, but that's ultimately, if you go back to Logan and Mullich's growth machine thesis, that's one of the key things they were writing about, was this demographic growth of places, which means adding population, which means adding housing in all likelihood. So why it doesn't get talked about as much, I don't know. But I think that we should be, and that's why I hope that the paper gains some traction, and this is something we continue talking about. Like the last question asked me, I would sure love to talk more, learn more about pathways to implementation for those things, like the real estate requirement. If the real estate industry in Alberta already considers it a best practice to inform people of flood risk, and they actually have sort of a step-by-step guide for doing that for real estate agents, it really isn't a far leap to then actually require it. I don't think, again, maybe I'm incredibly naive there.
Thank you. And then with regards to non-experts sort of joining the conversation, how can we expect non-experts to be informed on something as complex as the cost benefit of engineered flood protection systems? What are your views on that?
I don't think we can expect, you know, the average Joe in the public to have an expert level understanding of flood risk. And, you know, we already know that's true, right? We know that there's research on how people understand and look at flood maps, on how they understand living in the 1 in 100 year flood zone. And a lot of the research shows things that people think that it means that a flood only happens every 100 years. So if it happened in 2013, it won't happen again until 2113. People actually think these things. And so if people have such a poor general understanding of risk, they're probably not going to overnight become experts on, you know, what kinds of requirements will be necessary to raise homes in flood prone areas, to do those sorts of things. I don't see that necessarily as realistic, but not being an expert doesn't mean you can't be part of the conversation about something either, because what people are experts on is their everyday life and how much risk they're willing to accept, and their attachment to place that they feel in their neighborhoods. And all of these things are important too. People's values, what they care about, what they want in a neighborhood, those things can be taken really, really seriously. And I think it's incumbent upon the people who are experts in those areas to communicate to the public very, very clearly in very plain language about what this means. That's actually what one of the participants was saying earlier about the real estate industry potentially communicating risk to people. Not just tell us, but actually explain what this means. And she was looking for that and had never had that. So I think scientific communication is crucially important, and an overlooked area that will allow us to have these multi-party, if not strictly two-way conversations between the public and between flood risk experts. Esther, did we lose you again? We may have. So there's another question I see. It's just the first one I see, so I apologize if I skipped anybody. Seth asks, I'm wondering if you could comment on how useful these, oh, that's the one I just answered, isn't it? These non-expert opinions are. Yeah, I guess I would just piggyback off of that and say, I think that the public can be better informed, and I think we can do a good job of informing the public, and that's sort of everyone's responsibility if you work in that space. But again, if you have a public that feels excluded from the conversation, that public's never going to be brought up to speed on the technical matters because they feel like they're not part of the discussion at all, period, to begin with.
Okay, again, we have some technical issues. So we just have a couple more questions, actually, Prof. I apologize for that. Let me just get to these last questions. Okay, so can you comment on how the lack of flood risk information such as accurate flood maps, was addressed in your work. So we just have one more question after this one.
Yeah, so sort of two things here. One, was it addressed in this actual paper? Not really. A number of participants did comment on it. One of them said something like, to me, it seems like the flood maps are always changing. At one point I'm in the floodplain, another point I'm not in the floodplain. And so I don't know what that actually means for me in terms of real risk. A number of others also talked about not understanding if it really meant, 2% annual probability of flood risk or 8% or what they were. There was this knowledge gap. And it's hard for people to make, we're expecting people to make rational economic decisions, and in many cases with their life savings, purchasing a home when they don't have good information about it. That's not entirely the fault of the people who make flood maps either. It's simply, I think, a science communication gap where it's not being communicated to people. And I meet people in Calgary all the time who are thinking about buying homes in river adjacent communities who don't really have a sense of what is the actual risk other than this home's never flooded before, so I should be good, using the past to predict the future. So I don't know if that doesn't really answer the question. I mean, there's a lot of literature. I've seen quite a bit of it out there on the sort of problematic aspects of flood mapping and how flood mapping is not only how they can change and how they're a result in some cases of a more political process, but also how they're almost made to be misinterpreted by the public as well. So again, I think science communication is critically important, not just for this, but for climate and environmental scientists who are communicating the scientific reality and consensus about climate change to people and so on. It's really important to communicate in ways that it will resonate and that makes logical sense to people. So that's the best answer I got there.
Okay, thank you. We only have time for maybe one more question. Let's scan this quickly. So this is a perspective and unique insight that is sorely needed in climate risks loom large. As climate risks loom large, the political reach of developers reeks of corruption as one of the major root causes of putting people in harm's way for profit motivations. How do we societally stem this concern?
That's a big one. Yeah, when you say it reeks of corruption, I was trying to not say that in the talk today, to say, look, here are campaign contributions that municipal politicians get from developers. That's a fact. Whether and to what extent that influences council's decisions about, where and whether and how to approve permitting, what regulations to put in place, those are not discussions that take place in a room where I am. So I don't know how much influence it actually wields. The literature from other places suggests that it wields tremendous influence. Whether that's true here in Calgary or not, I don't know. So I was careful not to call it any form of corruption. But then the question, what was the second part of the question? I can't find that one in the chat. So
let me read that out for you. 1 second. Take out the chat. We have many chats, so just give me a second. Okay, 1 second.
Sorry, I kind of lost. That was a two-pronged thing, and I had to give my disclaimer first.
Yes, it was. 1 second. It was, so the political reach of developers reeks of corruption, as I said, as one of the major root causes of putting people in harm's way for profit motivations. How do we societally stem from this concern? That was the question.
Okay, that's a big one. I mean, I think my prediction would be as more disasters happen, people will become more vocal and demand to be involved in the conversations about this topic. As we've sort of talked about before, I don't know that that's going to be welcome necessarily by all politicians and by all risk mitigation experts, but I think the public will demand that as losses mount. Other than that, I think it's conversations like this, and hopefully, I've seen some people in the chat who come from different interest areas and different walks of life who came to the talk today. So maybe conversations like today will help in a very, 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 very small way. Yeah, I always hope that the public demands to be included in these discussions. But you know, most members of the public are not experts in these areas either. But yeah, I don't have a really good answer for this one because, you know, here's what I would say. The current way that we do things has so much inertia already that pushing back against that inertia can be really challenging, especially if you feel like you're not included in those spaces and don't have an outlet to be able to have the conversations. Like one of the comments earlier said, I think it might have been Seth, who said some of the respondents hadn't even thought about these issues before. It's true. And these are the residents of Calgary who are most likely to have thought about these issues because they have been through a major flood event, 39 out of the 40 flooded. And yet for some of these issues, it was sort of, for some of these folks, it was sort of the first time they had thought about it. So is it realistic to expect that, you know, in Calgary's 26 flood affected communities, that the majority of folks, or even a lot of the folks, are going to, you know, demand to be included in conversations about ongoing risk reduction? Probably not. I don't have a very sanguine view of that, unfortunately. I love to see public participation in political affairs, and I think it's hard to get that sometimes. So if you all have ideas, I would love to know what your ideas are to sort of mobilize some kind of collective response to involve the public in various ways. But I don't know.
Yeah, and that's so similar to another question, suggestions for how citizens can motivate for safer development or risk reduction. We had just one comment to why not hold the developers accountable for long-term liability risks of developing in floodplains. I just want to thank everybody. Sorry for keeping you on longer than expected, but we just have one last question, Prof, if you have the time.
Sure, absolutely.
This one last question. Get it up here. How does one retreat from rivers in the looming age of atmospheric rivers and cloudbursts? That's just a comment question. Yeah.
How does one retreat? Well, I don't know that one does retreat. If you look at like Liz Kozlov's work, it was communities meeting, forming that social capital, those networks, getting to know one another, realizing that their long-term, what was in their long-term best interest was to move away from risky coastal areas, and then approaching the municipal government in New York, as well as the state governments in both New York and New Jersey, and advocating for community buyouts. So it was pushing from the bottom up, but I don't think any of us can probably do that individually, other than just selling our house that's in a floodplain and moving somewhere else. But that doesn't stem or solve the more systemic issues. It just protects me from flooding. So I think, again, community discussions, bottom up initiatives are the only way to sort of change the conversation around flood risk.
Thank you for that, Prof. And that brings us to the end. Thank you all for attending and staying on for so long. This is a very informative presentation and also a very interesting discussion after. So thank you for that. I should throw it back over to you, Prof, to see if you have any closing remarks.
1 second here. I'm struggling with the technology. I don't have any other questions. What I do have is, I can't find the chat. I was going to link to the 2 articles so anybody could check them out if they wanted to. And I can't seem to be able to pull open the chat right now and don't know why.
You could also send it to us at ICLR and we could distribute.
Oh, nice. Okay, maybe we'll do that then, because, oh wait, I figured it out, sorry. So here's one of them. And then the more sort of conversational, popular version of it is this one right here. Okay, so if anyone wants to check them out, they're both open access, so they're not paywalled or anything, and you can certainly check them out. My purpose in both of them was just to say, hey, here's what flood affected Calgarians think about this kind of development. So then you can do with it what you will.
And thank you. And I'm just reminding everybody that the next Friday forum will be on January 21st. And again, we'll have Lucy Jones, and we're looking at planning for big earthquakes and big climate disasters. So we look forward to seeing everybody there. Have a good weekend. Thank you so much.